"Nobody's coming for you, Abigail. Just say yes and get it over with." That was what the Reverend whispered to her at the church door. 63 people inside, all waiting not to celebrate, but to watch. She had been called cursed, unwanted, the town's permanent joke. And the man at the altar hadn't chosen her. He'd been cornered into her. She knew every whisper, every pitying look, every word that would follow her back down that aisle. She walked in anyway, chin up, eyes forward. And when she reached the man who had been forced to marry her, she gave him the last thing anyone expected. She smiled. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the bell, so you never miss a new story, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning of the wedding, Luke Maddox stood behind the church and seriously considered riding north and never coming back. He had done the math 3 times. Without the state relief contract, the bank would call his note by October. He'd lose the south pasture first, then the water rights, then everything his father had built from nothing in a territory that tried to kill men like him every single winter. 30 years of Maddox sweat and blood, and it was going to end because the sky forgot to rain. He pressed his back against the rough-cut boards and stared at the ground. Gerald Hatch, the county land commissioner, had explained it plainly enough 2 weeks ago, sitting across from Luke in that leather chair, like a man who had never once needed anything from anybody. "The homestead relief contract is restricted to married landowners," Hatch had said. "That's federal language, Maddox. I don't write the law. I administer it." "Then find me another way," Luke said. "There isn't one." "There's always another way." Hatch leaned forward. "Abigail Carter has been designated as the county's relief coordinator for the Willow Creek district. If you marry her, you get the contract. She gets a home and a name that isn't mocked every Sunday. Everybody walks away with something." Luke had stood up so fast, the chair scraped the floor. "You're trading a woman like she's a parcel of land." "I'm offering you both a lifeline," Hatch said calmly. "What you do with it is your business." Luke had walked out. He'd gone home, fed his horses, eaten a cold supper, and lay awake until 3 in the morning listening to the wind come down off the mountains. He'd thought about his father. He'd thought about the men who worked for him, 14 of them counting the seasonal hands, and the families those men were feeding. By morning, he had talked himself into it. That didn't mean he felt good about it. He heard boots in the grass behind him, and turned to find his foreman, Ellis Pruitt, standing there with a look on his face that was half sympathy and half something that resembled amusement. "Church is about full," Ellis said. "I know. Preacher's asking for you." "I heard him." Ellis was quiet for a moment. He picked a piece of dry grass off his sleeve, turned it in his fingers. "You ever met her before all this, I mean? Seen her around town?" "That's not what I asked." Luke looked at him. "No, not really." Ellis nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "She came by the ranch Thursday, while you were at the bank." Luke frowned. "What for?" "Brought a basket. Said she thought the hands might appreciate something home-baked given the circumstances." He paused. "She also left a ledger, marked up in pencil. Said she noticed from the county records that you've been double billed on your feed contract for going on 3 years. Luke stared at him. "Double billed," Ellis repeated. "She calculated it out. You're owed somewhere close to $400 in overcharges." The silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "She didn't stay," Ellis added. "Didn't ask for anything. Just left the basket in the ledger and walked back to town." Luke turned and looked at the church door. Through the thin walls, he could hear people talking, the particular murmur of a crowd that has gathered, not in celebration, but in curiosity, the kind that feeds on other people's discomfort. "Let's go," he said. The inside of the church smelled like candle wax and too many bodies in summer heat. Luke walked down the center aisle and stopped at the front, and he could feel every eye in the room tracking him like he was an animal they'd cornered. He saw the banker Crawford sitting in the 3rd row with his wife. He saw Gerald Hatch near the back with his arms folded and an expression of quiet satisfaction. He saw his neighboring rancher Tom Briggs, who gave him a look that said he was sorry, and relieved it wasn't him both at once. He faced front and waited. He heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps, not music. Just the shift in the room, the particular quality of silence that drops when people are trying not to be caught staring. Then she was beside him. Luke had expected to feel nothing. He'd prepared himself to feel nothing. He was conducting a business transaction, and he had categorized it that way in his mind, and he intended to keep it there. But she was not what the town's talk had led him to expect. She was not desperate. She was not pathetic. She was not visibly broken by the circumstances that had brought her here. Abigail Carter stood straight. She wore a gray dress, plain and well made, and her dark hair was pinned back simply. She was 32 years old, and the town had been calling her an old maid for at least a decade, and she walked into that church like the word meant nothing to her at all. She looked at him once briefly. Then she faced forward. Reverend Hollis began to speak. Luke got through the ceremony the way he got through most things he didn't want to do, by focusing on what came after. He said the words he was supposed to say. He heard her say them back in a voice that was quiet and steady. When the Reverend declared them married, there was a sound from the crowd that wasn't quite applause. It was more like the collective release of breath from people who had been holding it, waiting to see if someone would put a stop to the whole thing. Nobody did. It was over in 12 minutes. He turned to look at her, because that was what you did, and he found her already looking at him. And then she smiled. It was not a performance. It was not the brittle, defiant expression he might have expected from a woman publicly humiliated in front of 63 people who had shown up partly just to watch her be humiliated. It was small and genuine, and it reached her eyes, and for one moment it was the only real thing in that entire church. He stood there, and he did not know what to say. Behind them, someone whispered low and audible, "Poor Luke." Someone else, a woman, murmured back, "She'll run the man ragged inside a month. You watch." A third voice, barely bothering to be quiet at all. 32 years old. No wonder nobody wanted her. Abigail heard every word. Luke watched her hear them. He watched her face, waiting for the smile to collapse, waiting for the pain to come through, and what happened instead was something he didn't expect. Her chin lifted almost imperceptibly. The smile didn't disappear, it held. She took his arm the way a woman takes the arm of a husband, and she walked with him out of that church and into the Montana summer, and she did not look back at any of them. Luke didn't say a word until they reached the wagon. He helped her up, and when she was seated, he stood for a moment with his hand on the sideboard. "I want you to know," he said, "that I'll treat you fairly." She looked down at him. "I know. I'm not going to pretend this is something it isn't." "Mr. Maddox," she said, and her voice was entirely level. "Neither am I. I don't need pretending. I need a fair house and honest work, and to be left in peace. That's all." He looked at her for a moment. Then he climbed up beside her and turned the horses toward home. The ranch was 20 minutes outside of Willow Creek, past the dry creek bed that had given the town its name, and up a long slope, where the grass was still more brown than green from the drought. The house was solid, 2 stories built to last, but everything about it looked like it had been maintained by a man who considered maintenance a necessary inconvenience rather than a source of pride. Abigail stepped down from the wagon before he could help her, which surprised him. She stood and looked at the house for a moment. Not the way a woman looks at something she's disappointed in. The way a person looks at a problem they're already solving. "The kitchen garden," she said. He followed her gaze to the patch behind the house that had gone to weeds. "It's been dry," he said. "The well is still good." "Yes." "Then the soil is fine. It just needs work." She turned and looked at the barn. "How many hands do you have?" 14 in summer, 9 through winter." "Anyone with a medical need I should know about? Old injury, chronic pain, that kind of thing?" Luke stared at her. "Why?" "Because those men work for your ranch, and if they're hurting, they're not working at full capacity, and that costs you." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she might say the sky was blue. "I'm not prying. I just want to be useful." He didn't answer right away. He was recalculating something. "Ellis has a bad knee," he said finally. "Left one. Cold weather makes it worse." She nodded once, like she was filing it away. "I'll make a note of it." She walked toward this house, and he stood by the wagon and watched her go, and he felt the same sensation he'd felt in the church, that he was missing something, that he had come into this situation with a set of assumptions about this woman that were quietly proving themselves wrong, one by one. Ellis was the first to warm to her, which surprised exactly nobody who knew Ellis Pruitt. By the end of the first week, he was eating his noon meals at the kitchen table instead of by the barn. By the end of the second, 2 more hands had followed him in. She didn't invite them. She just cooked enough for whoever showed up. "She fixed my saddle yesterday," a young hand named Cody told Ellis one evening. "Just noticed the stitching was going and fixed it. Didn't say anything about it. She found a billing error in the feed contract 3 years back," Ellis replied. $400. Cody whistled. "Luke, get it back." "He's working on it." What Ellis didn't tell Cody was that he'd watched Abigail spend 40 minutes that same afternoon at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger cross-referencing 2 years of supply invoices against market prices, and when Luke had come in from the south pasture, she'd handed him a single page of notes that identified 3 more vendors who had been systematically overcharging him. Luke had stood there reading the page. "How long did this take you?" he asked. "A few hours over 3 evenings," she said. "The books were available. I hope you don't mind." "Mind?" He looked up at her. "Abigail, this is—" He stopped. "Nobody's done this before." "Nobody had the time to sit down with it properly," she said. "I do." He set the paper down on the table between them. "I owe you a thank you," he said. She smiled, that small, quiet smile. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Maddox." "Luke," he said. "If we're going to share a table, you might as well use my name." She tilted her head slightly, considering. "All right, Luke." He picked up the paper again and carried it to his desk, and if he noticed that Ellis was standing in the doorway having witnessed the entire exchange, he chose not to acknowledge it. Ellis went back to the barn. He was smiling. The first time Luke asked himself a real question about her was on a Wednesday evening the 3rd week of their marriage. He had come back from checking the north fence later than expected, and the house was dark except for the light in the kitchen. He almost didn't notice her because she was sitting on the back step, and she had a shawl pulled around her shoulders, and she was looking out across the flat dark of the range. He stopped. "You should be inside. It's getting cold." "I know. I just wanted a few minutes." He stood there not quite sure whether to go in or stay. "Bad day." She was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Healy came by the schoolhouse today. She pulled her daughter out of class." He knew Mrs. Healy, married to one of the town council members. "Why?" "She said she didn't want her daughter being taught by a woman who'd had to be married off by committee." Abigail's voice didn't shake, but it was also not entirely steady. Those were her words. Luke said nothing. "The little girl cried," Abigail said. "That's the part I keep thinking about. She didn't want to go. She was right in the middle of learning her multiplication tables." "I'll talk to Healy." "Please don't." She said it quickly. "It'll make it worse. It always makes it worse when someone fights back on my behalf. They just find new angles." She paused. "I know how to handle it." "That smile," he said before he'd decided to say it. She turned and looked at him. "You do it every time," he said. "Someone says something ugly and you just keep your chin up and you smile, like it doesn't touch you." She was quiet for a long moment. "It touches me," she said. Then she stood, shook out her shawl, and went inside. Luke stood on the back step in the cold for a while after that. He wasn't thinking about the fence or the north pasture or the banknote due in October. He was thinking about a woman who had been learning to make herself bulletproof one smile at a time for a very long time. The piece of information that changed everything came not from Abigail, but from old Clara Whitmore, who ran the dry goods counter and had known everyone in Willow Creek for 40 years. Luke had come in for rope and nails on a Thursday morning, and Clara had watched him for a minute, and then said without being asked, "You know about Thomas Webb, I suppose?" Luke looked up. "Who?" Clara's expression shifted. "She never told you." "Told me what?" Clara set down the nails she'd been counting and leaned on the counter. "Thomas Webb. Young man came through here around 1876. Worked the river survey crew. He and Abigail were engaged. Had the whole thing planned spring wedding house on the edge of the Carter property." She paused. "He drowned. February of 77. Ice gave way on the Yellowstone while the crew was crossing." Luke stood very still. "Abigail was 21, Clara continued. "After it happened, people around town started well. You know how people get. Someone said she was cursed, that she'd brought bad luck on the boy. Then someone added to it, and someone added to that. And by the time the story had been around long enough, she was the woman no decent man would touch. Ridiculous. All of it." Clara's voice was flat with disgust. "But once a story gets set in a place like this, it doesn't come out." Luke put down the rope he was holding. "She was 21 years old, he said. 21 years old and engaged to a man she loved, and then he was gone and the whole town decided it was her fault somehow." Clara looked at him steadily. "That smile of hers. You've probably noticed it." He met her eyes. "She started doing that about a year after Thomas died," Clara said. "Every time someone said something cruel. Every time she walked past a group of women and heard them stop talking, she'd just straighten up and smile. Like she was saying, 'You don't get to have this. You don't get to see me break.'" Clara shook her head slowly. "I always thought it was the bravest thing I ever saw, and the saddest." Luke paid for his rope and nails and walked out into the street. He stood there in the summer heat and thought about Abigail at 21, burying a man she'd planned her life around, and then putting on that smile and wearing it like armor for 11 years. He thought about every casual cruelty she'd absorbed since then and responded to with that same quiet dignity. He thought about the girl pulled out of her classroom for being married by committee. He thought about her sitting on the back step in the cold, not complaining, just needing a few minutes. He got on his horse and rode back to the ranch, and something inside him had shifted, though he couldn't yet name what it was or what to do about it. That evening at supper, he watched her. Not obviously, not in a way she'd notice. But he watched the way she moved through the kitchen, the efficient grace of a woman who had been managing a household alone for years. He watched her serve the meal without ceremony, without expecting to be thanked, without any indication that she found anything remarkable about making a good supper for a man who had barely spoken to her in 3 weeks. "Clara Whitmore told me about Thomas Webb," he said. She stopped. Her back was to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she turned around. Her face was composed. Of course it was. She had years of practice. "She shouldn't have," Abigail said. "Maybe not. But I'm glad she did." He waited a beat. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's not your business," she said, not unkindly. "And because I didn't want to start this, whatever this is, with you feeling sorry for me. I can't stand pity. I never could." "I don't pity you," he said. She looked at him. "What I feel," he said carefully, "is something closer to anger. At this town. At the way they—" He stopped, steadied himself. "You spent 11 years being treated like a curse because a man you loved died in an accident. That's not sorrow. That's an injustice." She set down the dish she was holding. Her face was doing something complicated that she was working hard to control. "Luke," she said quietly, "please don't make me cry at the supper table. I've worked very hard not to cry at this table." He almost laughed. He didn't expect that. "All right," he said. "Sit down. Eat your supper." She sat down. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. Some door had opened that neither of them had expected to find in this strange, uncomfortable arrangement they'd been dropped into. Abigail looked up at him once near the end of the meal. She smiled. Not the armor smile. Something smaller and more real. Luke looked back at her, and he did not look away. The smile Luke had seen at the end of supper, the small, unguarded one, stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. He didn't tell anyone about it. There was nothing to tell. It was a look across a table at the end of a quiet meal. Nothing more. But he found himself over the next several days watching for it, noticing when it appeared and when it didn't. Learning the difference between the versions of it, which was more information than he had intended to gather about Abigail Carter Maddox. He told himself it was practical. A man needed to understand the person living in his house. Ellis, who had known Luke for 11 years and therefore saw through most of his self-deceptions, said nothing. He just watched, and occasionally allowed himself a small private satisfaction that he did not share with anyone. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that surprised Luke at almost every turn. He was a man who had managed his own household for 8 years since his father passed, and his mother moved back east to her sister. He had believed he managed it adequately. He kept the books. He paid the hands. He fed himself and kept the roof sound. What more did adequate require? Abigail answered that question without being asked. Within 10 days of her arrival, the kitchen was running at roughly 2/3 the cost it had been running at before, and the food was better. Luke didn't understand how both of those things could be true simultaneously until she explained it one morning over coffee, and she only explained it because he asked directly, not because she was waiting to be praised. "You were buying beef from Crawford's store at market price," she said, turning a page in the ledger she'd made her own. "But the Halsey family 3 miles north has been running surplus cattle every season for 2 years. They'd rather sell local than drive them to market. The price difference is nearly 40%. I know the Halseys." "Then you could have done this any time," she said, and there was no judgment in it, just fact. "I didn't think of it," he admitted. "Most people don't. They do what they've always done until someone sits down with the numbers." She closed the ledger. "I'll go by the Halsey place Thursday if you don't mind. Martha Halsey and I get on well." He nodded. Then, because it had been sitting in the back of his mind, "Is there anything you need for yourself? Not the ranch. For you." She looked up at him with an expression that suggested the question was unexpected enough to require a moment's processing. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. "There's a medical book I've been trying to acquire. Dr. Warren's Household Compendium. The general store doesn't carry it, and I'd have to order from Billings." "Order it. It's not cheap." "Order it," he said again. "Use the household account." She looked at him for a second longer, and then she nodded, and he went out to the barn before she could thank him, because he found he didn't want thanks. He just wanted her to have the book. That realization troubled him somewhat, and he spent the better part of the morning trying not to examine it too closely. The hands adored her. That was the simplest way to say it. It didn't happen all at once. Ranch hands were skeptical creatures by nature. They'd seen foremen come and go, owners' wives who lasted one Montana winter and fled back to civilization arrangements that fell apart by spring. They watched Abigail the way they watched any newcomer, which was to say carefully and from a distance. But she did not behave like someone trying to earn approval. She noticed things. She remembered things. When young Cody came in from night watch, 3 days running looking like he hadn't slept, she set a cup of something hot in front of him without comment and asked quietly if something was keeping him awake. Turned out his mother back in Missouri was ill, and he'd had no way to reach her. Abigail had written the letter herself. He wasn't a confident writer, and helped him work out what to say. When old Rogelio, who had been with the ranch for 7 years, and whose English was workable but not comfortable, got into a dispute with a supply driver who short-delivered, and then argued about it. Abigail came out of the house, reviewed the delivery slip against the order, informed the driver in precise and unambiguous terms that he was incorrect, and waited while he recounted and produced the missing items. She never raised her voice. The driver left looking chastened in a way that yelling would never have produced. Rogelio told everyone that evening that Mrs. Maddox was formidable. He said it in a tone that was purely admiring. Ellis told Luke about it that night. Luke said, and went back to reading his survey report. But he set the report down 3 minutes later and stared at the wall instead. The first real test came on a Friday evening 18 days into their marriage. Luke had ridden to town for a land office meeting and come back later than he planned. And when he walked into the kitchen, he found Abigail at the table with a woman he recognized as Patricia Voss, whose husband owned the largest dry goods operation in Willow Creek. Patricia was crying. Abigail was not. She had one hand over Patricia's and was talking to her in a low, steady voice, and she looked up when Luke came in without any indication of embarrassment or interruption. "There's supper on the stove," she said. "We'll be a little while." He served his own plate and ate in the other room, and he heard the murmur of their voices without catching the words. And after about half an hour, he heard the front door, and then quiet. Abigail came in and began clearing things from the table. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Her husband's been gambling," she said simply. She had nowhere to go with it. "She came to you." Abigail glanced at him. "People come to me when they need somewhere to put things they can't say out loud." She paused. "Funny, isn't it? The woman the whole town pities turns out to be the one they come to when they're ashamed." He looked at her. Not funny. Instructive. She considered that. Then she sat down across from him with her own plate, which she hadn't touched yet, and they ate together in the easy quiet that had become without either of them formally deciding it their evening habit. It was Luke who broke the silence this time. "Hatch stopped me at the land office today," he said. She set her fork down. "What did he want?" "To remind me that the relief contract renewal comes up in November, and that my continued eligibility will depend on the marriage being his word substantive." He said the last word with a flatness that communicated precisely what he thought of Gerald Hatch's vocabulary. Abigail's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's checking up on us. He'll send someone out. Probably Crawford's wife who'll report back." Luke pushed his plate aside. "I want you to know because I think you deserve to know. Not to alarm you. Just you should be aware." She was quiet for a moment. "Does it change anything for you?" The question surprised him. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" She stopped. Started again. Some men would take that as an opportunity to renegotiate the terms, to remind the wife what her position depends on. The room was very still. "I'm not that kind of man," he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once with a deliberateness that said she was filing that information away somewhere important. "Good," she said, and she picked up her fork and finished her supper. 2 weeks later, Luke rode out to the east pasture in the early morning and found Abigail there before him. She was on foot, which meant she'd walked nearly a mile from the house before sunrise. She was crouched near the fence line examining something on the ground, and when she heard him ride up, she stood and turned without startling. "There's a section of fence down at the creek crossing," she said. "About 60 feet. The ground's been shifting with the dry. Rogelio and Cody probably don't know yet." He dismounted and looked at the fence. She was right, the posts had heaved and the wire had followed. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" he asked. "Couldn't sleep. I walk when I can't sleep." She shrugged. "I've been walking this land since I was a girl. The Carter property backed up against your east pasture years ago." He looked at her. "Your family's land." "My father's land. He sold it in 1880, after my mother passed." A brief pause. "I used to know every foot of this country." Something shifted in the quality of the silence between them. "You never left," he said. "No. Even after—" He stopped. "After everything." She said it plainly. "This is my home. Some people would say I should have gone. Started fresh somewhere that didn't know my name." She looked out across the land. but running always seemed like giving them exactly what they wanted. Confirmation that I was what they said I was. He stood beside her, looking at the broken fence, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, and it was one of those rare silences that carries more weight than speech. "I'll get the crew out here this morning," he said finally. "I'll go back and start breakfast then." She turned to walk. "Abigail." She stopped. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "In Willow Creek, all those years." She didn't turn around immediately. He couldn't see her face. "Thank you for saying so," she said quietly. Then she walked back across the open land toward the house, and Luke stood at the broken fence in the early morning light and thought that he was becoming someone he hadn't fully expected to become. The medical book arrived from Billings on a Thursday. Luke knew because Ellis told him, and Ellis knew because Cody had been the one to collect it from the post station and had practically run it back to the ranch on account of Abigail having mentioned it twice and him wanting to be the one to deliver it. What Luke didn't know until he came in from the south pasture that same afternoon was what would be happening in the front room. He heard voices before he opened the door. Children's voices. He stepped inside to find 4 children seated on the floor in a rough semicircle, all of them looking up at Abigail, who was reading to them from what was emphatically not the medical book, but appeared to be some kind of mathematics primer. She looked up at him with the expression of someone who is aware that an explanation might be helpful. "The Calloway children," she said. "Their mother is with the baby. She had the baby yesterday. Everything went well, and their father is in the field. I offered to keep them for the afternoon." The oldest, a girl of maybe 9, looked up at Luke with the calm appraisal of a child who has not yet learned to be intimidated by large men. "She's teaching us fractions," the girl said. "Is she?" said Luke. "It makes more sense the way she explains it," the girl added, as if this were information he needed. Luke looked at Abigail, who had the grace to look slightly amused rather than defensive. "I'll be out of your way in an hour," she said. "Take your time," he said. He went through to the kitchen, poured himself coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. And from the front room, he listened to her voice, explaining fractions to 4 children on a Thursday afternoon. Patient, clear, occasionally funny, always warm, and he sat there longer than the coffee required. When the children left, she came into the kitchen and started on supper without ceremony. "You were a teacher before all this," he said. "I still am, officially." She stirred something on the stove. "The school board renewed my contract last spring. I don't think they expected me to still be here by fall." "But you are." "But I am." A pause. "Though Mrs. Healy's petition to have me removed is gathering signatures, apparently." He went still. "She's filing a petition. She's trying to." Abigail set down the spoon and turned. Her voice was measured. "She's saying that a woman of my circumstances isn't a suitable influence on the children. She's using the word charity case. In writing." The anger that moved through Luke was immediate and surprisingly sharp. "I'll go to the school board," he said. "Luke, this is different. This is your livelihood. I know it is." She met his eyes. "And I genuinely appreciate that you want to go. But the moment you walk into that room and fight for me, half the board will dismiss it, because it's a husband defending his wife, and the other half will take it as confirmation that I can't fight my own battles." "Can you fight it?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat back. "All right. What do you need?" The slight surprise that crossed her face was subtle, but he caught it. She had expected argument. He had offered logistics instead. "Letters of support from parents," she said. "People whose children I've actually taught. And the school board minutes from the last 3 years, which will show that student performance in my classroom has been above county average every single term." "The Calloway girl," he said. "She knows fractions." Abigail's mouth curved. "She's 10, and she's already working at a 12-year-old level." "Write me a list of the parents to contact," he said. "I know most of them. Some of them owe me favors." She studied him. "Why are you doing this?" He held her gaze. "Because it's right," he said simply. and because someone should have done it years ago. The curve of her mouth became something fuller, more complicated. She turned back to the stove. "The list will be on the table by morning," she said. He collected 7 letters in 4 days. He didn't announce what he was doing. He rode out to the farms and ranches, talked to fathers. Mostly mothers would have been better witnesses to Abigail's teaching, but were less likely to be taken seriously by a board of men, and he said plainly that he needed written testimony about his wife's work with their children, and he needed it quickly, and he would be grateful. Not one of the 7 refused. 3 of them added something Luke hadn't asked for their own personal accounts of things Abigail had done for their families. One man, a struggling farmer named Burke, pressed a folded paper into Luke's hand without being asked and said, "She paid my son's school books 2 winters running and never said a word to anyone. She'll say she didn't, but she did. I want that in writing." Luke rode home that evening with 7 letters and a slightly different understanding of how his wife had been spending her time and her modest income for the past decade. He set the letters on the kitchen table. She picked them up and went through them one by one. He watched her read, watched her stop midway through Burke's letter and go very still. "He wrote about the books," she said mostly to herself. "He wanted it on record." She set the letters down carefully. She pressed her fingers flat against them. And then she looked up at him with an expression that was open in a way he hadn't seen from her before. Raw, unguarded, like something that had been held tightly for a long time had just loosened by 1 degree. "Nobody's ever done that," she said. "Gone around and gathered things, for me." He shrugged, because the moment felt too significant for easy words, and he wasn't a man who was comfortable with significance. "It needed doing." She nodded. She was holding herself together with visible effort, and he respected it too much to press on it. "Thank you," she said finally. "Don't mention it." But she was still looking at him, and there was something in that look he didn't know exactly how to file away or categorize or set at arm's length, so he picked up his hat and said he needed to check on the night stock, which was true, and he went out. He stood in the dark outside the barn for a while before going in. He was starting to understand that the problem was not that he knew too little about Abigail Carter. The problem was that the more he learned, the harder it was becoming to remember why he'd been keeping his distance in the first place. The school board meeting was on a Wednesday evening, and Abigail went alone, which Luke accepted only because she asked him to specifically, and he had learned to trust her instincts about the people in this town better than his own. She came home at 9:15. He was sitting up at the kitchen table with the pretense of paperwork. She came in and set her shawl over the chair and said, "They voted 5-2 in my favor." He let out a breath. "Good." Mrs. Healy left before the vote was finished. A pause. "She said some things on her way out that I won't repeat." "What kind of things?" "The kind that are meant to humiliate." Her voice was even. "The kind I've been hearing for 11 years. He looked at her across the table. "Abigail," he said. "I'm all right," she said quickly. "I know you are. That's not what I was going to say." He waited until she met his eyes. "I was going to say that you handled that board tonight the same way you handle everything. Head up, no flinching. And those 7 letters were in front of them because you were worth fighting for." Something moved across her face. She sat down. And for a moment she just sat there with her hands folded on the table, not smiling, not performing, just present and quiet and human in a way that felt more real to him than almost any conversation he'd had in years. "I've been alone a long time," she said. It wasn't self-pity. It was just a fact she was choosing to say out loud. "And I got good at it. Too good, maybe. So good that I forgot what it felt like when someone—" She stopped. "When someone what?" he said quietly. She looked at him. "When someone's on your side." He held her gaze and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and because he was becoming increasingly certain that the distance he'd been trying to maintain between himself and this woman was no longer the territory he'd believed it to be. Outside, the wind came off the mountains. Inside, the lamp burned between them on the kitchen table, and Luke Maddox, who had entered into this marriage with nothing but practicality and grim necessity, sat across from his wife and understood with perfect clarity that something had changed. He just wasn't ready yet to say it out loud. He wasn't ready to say it out loud, but the town had already noticed. That was the thing about a small place like Willow Creek. You could keep something private inside your own chest, and the people around you would still read it on your face in the way you moved in the half-second longer you held a door or turned toward a voice. Privacy was largely an illusion west of the Missouri, and Luke Maddox had lived here long enough to know that. He just hadn't anticipated becoming the subject of the observation quite this quickly. It started with small things. A comment from Tom Briggs at the feed store about how the Maddox ranch had looked livelier lately. A remark from the post clerk about Mrs. Maddox being one of the most organized customers he'd dealt with in 20 years. And then, less welcome, a particular kind of silence that fell when Luke walked into certain conversations in town, the silence of people who had been discussing him and his wife and were not ready to stop but had enough manners to wait until he left. He ignored it. He had a ranch to run, and a banknote with his name on it, and the relief contract renewal in November that still required Gerald Hatch's signature. He didn't have time for Willow Creek's appetite for other people's business. But then the Harvest Festival arrived, and ignoring it stopped being an option. The festival was the town's largest annual gathering, 3 days of market stalls and pie competitions and fiddle music, and the kind of forced communal cheerfulness that a hard-living frontier community needed at least once a year just to remind itself it was still alive. Everyone came. Skipping it was a statement, and Luke had no interest in making statements. He and Abigail went on Saturday morning, which was the main market day, and within 20 minutes he understood that they were not attending the festival so much as being observed at it. He felt it in the way the crowd moved around them. Not hostile or not exactly. More like curious. Like people who had written a story about these two and were now slightly unsettled to find the actual subjects not matching the narrative. Abigail moved through it with the ease of a woman who had been navigating this town's attention for years. She stopped to talk to Martha Halsey, who embraced her with genuine warmth. She crouched down to speak to a small boy who ran up to her from the direction of the schoolhouse. One of her students' face flushed with the excitement of seeing his teacher outside the classroom, and whatever she said to him made him laugh and run back to his family. She bought a jar of honey from a woman Luke didn't recognize and pressed it back into her hands along with something Luke suspected was more than the asking price. He walked beside her and said little, and watched the town recalibrate its understanding of Abigail Carter Maddox in real time. Not everyone recalibrated. That was the part that settled like a stone. He heard the first comment from across a market stall not directed at him, two men talking in the unhurried way of people who don't expect to be held accountable. One of them said something about Maddox having drawn the short end. The other laughed. Luke kept walking because Abigail hadn't heard it, and he wasn't going to be the one to make sure she did. But the second one she heard. They were standing near the baked goods table when Silas Croft materialized beside them with the particular energy of a man who has been drinking since mid-morning and has a crowd behind him. Croft was a merchant miner in actual standing, but loud in his own estimation, and he had been one of the voices at the wedding, whispering about poor Luke. He had the kind of face that smiles when it means to wound. "Maddox," he said loud enough to carry. "Didn't expect to see you and your arrangement out socializing." Luke felt Abigail go still beside him. "Croft," he said, with the flatness that usually ended conversations. It did not end this one. Croft looked at Abigail with the leisurely appraisal of a man who has decided he is entertaining the crowd. "Tell me, Mrs. Maddox, if that title still applies to a county contract situation, how does it feel to be the only woman at the festival whose husband had to be talked into the wedding by a land commissioner?" The crowd that had gathered, and it had gathered because people always gathered for this kind of thing. That was the worst of it, went quiet with the specific quality of silence that wanted permission to laugh. Luke moved. He was already turning toward Croft when he felt Abigail's hand on his arm. Not gripping, just resting there. "Stop." He stopped. He looked at her. She was not looking at Croft. She was looking at the table in front of her, and her hand was resting on his arm, and her face was doing something he had never seen it do before. The smile wasn't there. Not the armor smile, not the real one, not the small professional one she used on strangers. There was nothing. Just her face, bare for a single unguarded moment. And in that moment, Luke saw 11 years of it. Everything she'd absorbed. Everything she'd deflected. Everything she'd borne with that lifted chin and that steady gaze. And all of it had just landed at once. Because Croft had said it in public, in front of the whole town. And the crowd was quiet and waiting. And even her armor had a limit. The hand on Luke's arm dropped. She said very quietly, "Excuse me?" And she turned and walked away through the crowd, and nobody stopped her, and nobody followed her. Croft was already half turning back to the men beside him, with the grin of someone who believes he has won. Luke looked at him for a long moment. "Croft," he said. Croft turned back, still smiling. "If you speak to my wife again," Luke said at a volume calibrated so that the surrounding crowd could hear every word, in any tone, for any reason, "I'll make certain every merchant within 40 miles knows exactly how you've been weighting your flour scales. And I'll do it with the county inspector's report that's currently sitting in my desk drawer." He paused. "Do we understand each other?" The smile left Croft's face. The crowd had gone very quiet. "I thought so," Luke said. He turned and went after Abigail. He found her at the edge of the festival ground past the last row of stalls, standing with her back to everything, her arms folded tight against her chest, her head down. He came up beside her and stood there and said nothing for a moment. "I didn't need you to threaten him," she said. Her voice was tight. "I know. I did it anyway." A silence. "Is that real?" she asked. "The inspector's report. Every word of it. I've been deciding what to do with it for 3 months." He looked at the side of her face. "I was waiting for the right moment." She let out a breath. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "You weaponized it for me." "For us," he said. "He insulted my wife in public. That's my business." She turned her head and looked at him, and her face was still bare, still unguarded, still carrying the full weight of what Croft had done. "The smile is gone," he said softly. She looked away. "I know. Abigail, don't." Her voice broke on the single word. "Please don't be kind to me right now. I can survive cruelty. I've been surviving it for years. I'm not sure I can—" She stopped. "Can't what?" "Handle kindness. From you. Right now. In public." She pressed her lips together. "I'll cry, and I don't want to cry here." "Then let's go home," he said. She nodded without speaking, and he walked beside her to the wagon, and neither of them said anything on the drive back. But she was not alone in it. That was the difference. She was not alone in it anymore, and they both understood that. And it was both the simplest thing and the most enormous thing, and neither of them had the words for it yet. That evening she did cry. Not in front of him, or not intentionally. He had gone to the barn to feed the horses, which took longer than usual because Rogelio had left early for a family matter. And when he came back into the house, he heard the sound from the kitchen before he reached the door. He stopped on the step. He stood there and listened to a woman who had not allowed herself to do this in years finally let the weight of a decade come down. He waited until it was quiet. Then he went in. She was at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes red, and she looked at him when he entered with an expression that was half embarrassment and half defiance. Because Abigail Carter did not give ground easily, even to her own grief. "Say nothing," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "All right. And don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm something that needs to be handled carefully." He considered that. "I'm not looking at you like that. I'm looking at you like you're the toughest person I know, and even tough people have limits. And you just hit yours, and there's nothing wrong with that." She stared at him. "That's an extremely annoying thing to say," she said, "because now I want to cry again, and I already told you I didn't want to cry." "Then cry. There's nobody here but me." She pressed her hands against her eyes, And then after a moment she said muffled, "He said arrangement. In front of everyone. Like I was a piece of furniture that got delivered to the wrong address." "He's an idiot," Luke said. "He's an idiot that half the town was laughing with." "Half the town is wrong." She dropped her hands. Her eyes were still red. "You know what the worst part was? It wasn't even the words. I've heard worse. It was that for 1 second, I thought maybe this year would be different. That maybe coming to the festival with a husband would mean—" She stopped. "Mean what?" he said gently. She shook her head. "I was being foolish." "Mean what, Abigail?" She looked at him straight on. "That I'd finally belong somewhere in that town, not be looked at as the problem. Just belong." Her voice held nothing performative. This was the real thing. "That's all I ever wanted. Not pity, not rescue, just to belong somewhere among living people without someone always reminding me of all the reasons I shouldn't." Luke sat with that for a long moment. "You belong here," he said. "On this ranch. That's real. Whatever the town thinks about it." She looked at him, reading his face. "You mean that?" "I don't say things I don't mean." She nodded slowly. The redness around her eyes was fading. She sat up straighter, and he watched the posture shift, not the armor going back up, but something different, something steadier, like a person who has been carrying weight alone and has just for the first time been offered a second pair of hands. "Tell me about Thomas Webb," he said. She didn't look surprised that he brought it up. She'd known probably that this conversation was coming. "Clara told you the facts," she said. "What else is there? What was he like?" She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, he could see her deciding whether to open this door. Then, "He was funny. That was the first thing. He could make me laugh at nothing, at the most ordinary things. He had this way of looking at the world sideways that I'd never seen in anyone before." A pause. "He was kind. Genuinely kind, not politely kind. He meant it. You loved him. You loved." "I did. Simple. No performance. I was 21 years old, and I was completely certain about him, and I had never been completely certain about anything before. And after he died," she folded her hands on the table. "After he died, the town needed a reason. People always need a reason when something terrible happens to someone young. It's frightening otherwise, the idea that something that awful can just happen without cause. So they found a reason." Her voice was even almost clinical, which he understood was the only way she could talk about it. "I was the reason. The cursed woman. The bad luck. And once that story started, it was like a brush fire. By the time it had gone around twice, it was just true. Part of the town's understanding of itself. And you stayed anyway." "Thomas is buried 3 miles outside of town," she said. "I wasn't going to leave." Luke looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning between them, and outside the night was coming on, and somewhere outside an owl called once, and then stopped. "I've been unfair to you," he said. She blinked. "How?" "I kept my distance because I told myself this was a business arrangement. I knew what I was telling myself wasn't quite honest, but it was easier than the alternative." He held her eyes. "The alternative being that you're a real person who has been treated very badly for a very long time, and who deserved better than what this town and this arrangement and I have given you." Her expression was open, careful. "You've been more than fair." "I've been decent. That's not the same thing." They looked at each other across the lamp. "I don't know what to do with this," she said finally. "With you. With—" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "I'm not practiced at it." "Neither am I," he said. "You were married before." "For 4 years. She left in 81. Couldn't take the winters." He paused. "I don't blame her. The winters here are honest about what they are. Not everyone is built for honest things." Abigail looked at him. "Are you?" He thought about it. "I'm trying to be," he said. A long moment passed, and then she smiled. Not the armor. Not the professional. not the brave performance she'd been giving to the world since she was 22 years old. Something younger than all of that, and more fragile and entirely real, and it crossed her face in the lamplight like the first clear morning after a very long winter. And Luke looked at it and felt something in his chest move with the authority of something that has been in place for a long time finally giving way. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there it is. She looked at him uncertain. "That smile," he said softly. "The real one. I was starting to think I'd imagined it." She looked down at the table, and there was color in her face now, and she was very still. And then she said barely above a murmur, "Don't make a habit of looking at me like that, Luke Maddox." "Like what?" "Like you're figuring something out." "Maybe I am." She stood up and carried her cup to the counter, and stood with her back to him for a moment, and when she turned around, the smile had settled into something quieter, but it hadn't gone. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went down the hall. He sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight for a long time after that, not reading, not working, not doing anything practical at all. He was thinking about a woman who had kept herself armored for 11 years and had just for a few hours let him see what was underneath. And he was thinking about the fact that what was underneath was the most remarkable thing he had encountered in a very long time. He wasn't frightened by it. That in itself told him something. He rode to town the next morning before Abigail was awake. He didn't plan what he was going to say. Planning speeches was not his nature. He rode to the center of town on a Sunday morning when people were heading to church and therefore concentrated and paying attention. And he stopped his horse in front of the gathering and waited until enough heads had turned. Gerald Hatch was there. So was Crawford the banker. So were the Healeys and Silas Croft, who went noticeably pale when he saw Luke's expression. Luke looked over the crowd. "Yesterday at the festival," he said loudly enough to be heard by everyone in the street, and a good portion of those on the church steps. "A man in this town made a public joke about my wife. Several others laughed." He paused. "I want to say something about that." Nobody moved. "Every one of you has benefited from Abigail Carter in ways you haven't acknowledged, and in some cases probably don't even know about," he said. "She's paid doctor bills for children whose parents couldn't. She's fed widows through 3 winters without saying a word to anyone. She taught your children, and she taught them well, and the county records show it. She did all of that while this town was busy deciding she was a joke." The church steps were silent. "I married her because I had to," he said. "That's the truth, and I won't insult anyone's intelligence by pretending otherwise. But I want to be clear about something else." He let a beat pass. "She is the most capable, the most decent, and the most genuinely good person in this town. That is not sentiment. That is an observation based on evidence. And any person who takes it upon themselves to mock her in my presence again will find that I have considerably less patience than she does." He looked directly at Croft for a single moment. Croft looked at his shoes. Luke turned his horse and rode back toward the ranch. Behind him, the street was still quiet. Then somewhere on the church steps, someone began to clap. One person, then another. He didn't turn around to see who it was. He didn't need to. He was riding home to Abigail, and for the first time since this whole arrangement had started, home was the exact word for it, and it fit without any effort at all. Abigail found out about the speech from Ellis, not from Luke. Luke came home that Sunday morning, ate breakfast, mentioned that he'd stopped in town, and said nothing further about it. He poured his coffee and asked if the Halsey delivery had arrived, and whether Cody had fixed the east gate latch, and Abigail answered his questions and watched his face and understood that whatever had happened in town, he was not going to tell her about it voluntarily. Ellis told her at noon while Luke was out checking the south fence. He came into the kitchen on the pretext of asking about the lunch situation, and then stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has information he considers important and is deciding how to deliver it. "Just say it," Abigail said without looking up from the bread she was cutting. Ellis said it. She stopped cutting. She set down the knife. She stood at the counter with her back to him for a long moment. "He said all of that," she said. "In the street, in front of everyone." "Church crowd and then some," Ellis said. Hatch was there. Crawford. The Healeys. A pause. Croft. She turned around. Her expression was careful in the way that careful expressions are when a person is managing something large inside a small container. "He didn't tell me," she said. "No, ma'am." "Why didn't he tell me?" Ellis considered this. "My guess, he didn't do it for credit. He did it because it needed doing." He shrugged one shoulder. "Luke's like that. He doesn't announce the things he believes in. He just acts on them, and then acts like it was nothing." She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she picked the knife back up and went back to the bread. "Thank you, Ellis," she said quietly. He nodded and left her to it. She finished the bread and set it to rise and stood at the kitchen window, and she allowed herself briefly privately to feel the full weight of what Luke Maddox had done. Stood in the street on a Sunday morning and told the town the truth about her, publicly, voluntarily, without being asked, without wanting acknowledgement. She had spent 11 years waiting for one person to do that. One. And it had never happened. Until now. She pressed her fingertips against the windowsill and breathed through the feeling because she was not going to cry in the kitchen again. She had a rule about that now. But it was a near thing. Luke came in for lunch and she put the plate in front of him and sat down across from him and said, "Ellis told me." He looked up from the plate. "About this morning," she said. A brief pause. "Ellis talks too much." "Ellis talks exactly the right amount." She held his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me yourself?" He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Because I didn't do it for you to thank me for. I did it because it was true and it needed to be said. Those are different things." "I know they're different things," she said. "I'm not thanking you. I'm asking you why you didn't tell me." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. "Because I wasn't sure how you'd take it. You've told me twice now that you don't want people fighting your battles." "That was before," she said. "Before what?" She held his gaze. "Before I understood that you're not doing it because you think I can't fight. You're doing it because you think I shouldn't have to fight alone." The kitchen was very quiet. "Yes," he said simply. She nodded. Then she got up and refilled his coffee without being asked, and when she sat back down, they ate together in a silence that was warm and specific and did not require any further explanation. October arrived with cold mornings and the first suggestion of color in the hills, and the ranch ran the way a good ranch runs when everyone in it is pulling in the same direction. The banknote was within 2 payments of being resolved. The Halsey cattle arrangement had cut costs significantly. 3 of the vendor overcharges Luke had recovered through Abigail's ledger work had come back with interest, the largest being the feed contractor, who had apparently been quietly terrified for weeks that the discrepancy would surface and had settled fast when Luke's letter arrived. Gerald Hatch came by on a Tuesday morning for his substantive review. He walked through the house and the yard with the air of a man performing a duty. He found slightly beneath him, asked several questions that were really just different angles on whether Luke and Abigail were actually living as a married couple, and received answers from both of them that were entirely truthful and entirely unrevealing. When Hatch asked Abigail directly how she found ranch life, she said, "Purposeful," and smiled at him with the professional smile, the one that gave nothing away. When he asked Luke whether the arrangement had proven workable, Luke said, "More than workable," in a tone that closed the subject. Hatch left within the hour, his review apparently satisfied. He shook Luke's hand at the gate. He did not shake Abigail's. Luke noticed. He said nothing until Hatch's buggy was out of sight, and then he turned and said to Abigail, "I apologize for him." "Don't," she said. "He got what he came for and so did we. That's the deal." He looked at her. "You're very good at being practical about things that deserve to make you angry." "I've had a lot of practice," she said dryly. He laughed. It came out surprised the way his laughs usually did. Like laughter was something that caught him off guard rather than something he allowed. Abigail had noticed this about him over the weeks, that he was not a man who laughed easily, but when something genuinely struck him, when he was caught off guard by something funny or sharp or unexpectedly clever, The laugh was entirely real and entirely unguarded. She liked catching it. She was starting to plan for it, which was a thing she recognized and filed away under the category of information she was not quite ready to examine directly. He caught her expression. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You're thinking something." "I'm always thinking something," she said. "That's not news." He shook his head, still almost smiling, and went back to the barn, and she watched him go, and then went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the particular warm unsteadiness of a woman who is losing an argument with herself about something she's been trying not to feel. The storm came on a Thursday the second week of October. It announced itself the way Montana storms do, a change in the air pressure that the horses felt before the humans, a sky that went from clear to serious in under 2 hours. By midday, it was clear the hands needed to be in before nightfall, and the cattle needed to be moved to the lower pasture where the land sheltered. Luke coordinated the movement with Ellis and had the cattle settled and the horses in and the hands accounted for by 4 in the afternoon, which was efficient work. He was doing a final check on the outbuildings when he realized that Cody was not in the bunkhouse. Ellis didn't know where he was. Rogelio had seen him heading toward the east fence line around noon with a repair kit and hadn't seen him since. Luke was already saddling up when Abigail came out of the house with his coat and an extra lantern. "East fence," he said. "I know. Ellis told me." She handed him the coat. "The creek crossing. He knows it's bad ground. He might have gotten caught in the mud when the rain started. Stay inside. I'll have hot water and dry clothes ready." She met his eyes. "Come back with him." He looked at her for a single moment with the focused intensity of a man who is being reminded of something he doesn't want to forget. "I will," he said. He found Cody a mile and a half out on foot, one boot stuck deep in the creek mud and his horse tied to a post 20 yards away, watching the situation with what appeared to be horse-specific contempt. The boy had been trying to work himself free for the better part of an hour and had succeeded mostly in exhausting himself and getting thoroughly soaked. Luke pulled him out by main force, and they rode back through rain that had gone from suggestion to conviction. Abigail had the kitchen warm. She had dry clothes from the bunkhouse that she'd retrieved and warmed. She had something on the stove that smelled like it would solve most immediate problems. She looked at Cody, 19 years old, shaking humiliated to the precise degree that a 19-year-old boy can be humiliated by needing rescue, and she pointed at the fire and said, "Sit. Don't talk yet." Cody sat. She looked at Luke. "You too. You're both soaked." "I'm fine." "Luke." He sat down. She moved around the kitchen with the efficiency he'd come to recognize as her natural state, and within 15 minutes, she had 2 men warming up with food in front of them and dry socks on their feet, which Luke considered a logistical achievement, comparable to some military operations he'd read about. Cody, thawing by degrees, looked at Abigail and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Maddox. I should have been back before it turned." "Yes," she said simply. "You should. Next time, leave the fence and come home. Wire can wait. You can't." He nodded, properly chastened. Then, "That soup is the best thing I've ever tasted." "It's just broth and vegetables," she said. "I know," he said. "Still." She smiled at him, the genuine one, warm and unguarded, and Cody, 19 years old and still somewhat new to the world, looked briefly like he'd been handed something he'd needed for a long time. Luke watched that smile land on the boy across the table, and he thought not for the first time about the particular quality of warmth that Abigail Carter could produce in the people around her without any apparent effort. It was not performance. It was not strategy. It was just her unfiltered, and it had a consistent and measurable effect on everyone who received it. He understood sitting there that he was not immune to it, that he had never been immune to it, that immunity had never really been available to him where this woman was concerned. He ate his soup and said nothing, but he thought about it long after Cody had gone to the bunkhouse and the storm was hammering the roof and the house was quiet. The line shack conversation started as a practical matter. They had ridden out together the following week, Luke doing his fence inspection, Abigail accompanying him to check on the Calloway family's homestead, which was an hour further, and they were a mile from the line shack, when the second storm of October decided to announce itself with more urgency than the weather had shown all month. Luke read the sky and said, "Line shack, now." They made it with 10 minutes to spare. The shack was small and functional wood stove, a cot, some emergency provisions, a lantern. Luke got the stove going while Abigail checked the provisions. Outside, the rain came down with purpose. Neither of them was going anywhere for a while. "This is the second time in a week your ranch has tried to keep me somewhere overnight," she said, looking at the provisions. "The ranch doesn't have opinions," he said. "The weather does." She turned around. "I found coffee. Real question, is it actually coffee, or has it been here since your father's time?" He looked at it. "Somewhere in between. We'll survive it." She set the pot on the stove and they settled into opposite sides of the small space. Him on the cot, her on the spare stool with her back against the wall, and the wind howled outside and the fire moved inside. And it was the most enclosed they had been physically and circumstantially since the wedding. She talked first, which surprised him. "I've been thinking about the contract renewal. Hatch signed off last week. We're good through spring." "I know. That's what I've been thinking about." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. The arrangement had a defined purpose. The ranch stabilizes the contract, renews we both. She stopped. "Both what?" he said. "Both continue in whatever direction makes sense." She kept her eyes on the cup. "I just want to know if you've thought about it." He was quiet long enough that she looked up. "I've thought about it," he said. And I've found that I don't want to think about it the way I thought I'd think about it." He met her eyes directly. "I thought I'd be calculating exit points. That's not what I find myself doing." She held his gaze. "What do you find yourself doing?" "Staying," he said simply. The words sat between them with weight. "Luke," she said carefully, "I need you to be honest with me. Not kind, not careful, honest. Because I have made the mistake once in my life of believing in something that wasn't permanent, and I'm not going to—" Her voice caught. She steadied it. "I can't afford to build something on ground that's going to shift." "I know," he said. "Do you, Abigail?" He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking straight at her. "I told 60 people on a Sunday morning that you were the best person in Willow Creek. I did not do that to satisfy Hatch's contract requirements. I did it because it was the most accurate thing I have ever said." She was very still. "I rode out in a storm to pull a boy out of creek mud because you told me to come back with him," he said. "Not because he's a good hand, though he is. Because the way you said come back with him, that mattered to me. You mattering to me, that's not a contract arrangement." She pressed her lips together hard. "I told you not to be kind to me," she said. "That wasn't kind," he said. That was the truth. She looked at him across the small space, across the lamplight, across everything they had been, and said, and argued about, and navigated together in 4 months of an arrangement neither of them had chosen, and he watched her face do the thing it did when she was deciding how much of herself to offer, and this time she did not hold anything back. "I'm terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "So am I." "You don't look terrified." "I look like a man sitting on a cot in a line shack in a storm trying to tell his wife the truth without making a mess of it," he said. "The terror is internal." She laughed, short and surprised and entirely genuine. And then she pressed her hand over her mouth because the laugh had tears right behind it, and she was managing both at once with the particular inefficiency of a person who is full of something and has nowhere left to put it. He got up from the cot. He crossed the small space. He crouched down in front of her so they were level. "You told me you stopped believing anyone could love you," he said quietly. "You said that in this shack in your head all the time you've been telling yourself that story." She looked at him with wet eyes and did not speak. "I'm telling you a different story," he said. "You can do with it what you want." A long moment passed. She reached out and put her hand against the side of his face, very briefly, the way a person touches something they're not sure is real. Then she pulled it back and looked at her own hand like it had done something without her permission. He straightened and went back to the cot because she needed that, and because he was a patient man, and because some things could not be rushed without being broken. They sat through the storm talking until the wind dropped about the ranch, about Thomas, about Luke's failed first marriage, about her childhood on the Carter property, and what it had felt like to watch it sold, about small things, about the kind of things two people exchange when they have stopped performing for each other and started simply existing in the same space. Somewhere past midnight, the storm eased. They rode back to the ranch in the quiet aftermath, two horses side by side in the wet dark, and when they reached the gate and dismounted, Abigail looked up at him in the faint light. "Luke," she said. "Yeah." "When you said staying." A pause. "You meant it." "Every word," he said. She nodded once. Then she took her horse to the barn. He stood at the gates in the cold and looked up at the sky, clearing star by star, and he felt the specific quiet of a man who has said the true thing and been heard, and he thought it was probably the most important conversation he'd had in 20 years. And he hadn't needed to plan a single word of it. The week after the line shack, something shifted in the daily texture of the ranch that everyone felt but nobody named directly. It wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement, no visible change in the arrangement. Luke still rose before dawn and went to the barn. Abigail still had coffee on before he came in. The hands still ate at the kitchen table, and Rogelio still left his boots at the wrong door. And Cody still asked Abigail questions he was too embarrassed to ask anyone else. The surface of things looked the same, but Ellis noticed that Luke had stopped coming in from the south pasture at the last possible minute before supper. He was coming in earlier. Not by a lot. 20 minutes maybe. But enough. Cody noticed that Mrs. Maddox had started leaving a cup on Luke's side of the kitchen counter, in the evenings the good cup, without being asked, the way a person does a thing that has become habit without ever being decided upon. Rogelio noticed that when the two of them disagreed about something, the timing of the winter supply order, the question of whether to take on an additional hand through November, they argued like people who expected to resolve it together, not like people tolerating each other's presence. None of them said anything. They were ranch hands, not gossips, and they understood that some things were better witnessed than discussed. What none of them saw was the conversation that happened on a cold Tuesday morning when Luke came in from the barn early before coffee, which he never did, and found Abigail at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands and an expression on her face that he had learned in 4 months to read with some precision. "What happened?" he said. She looked up. She held out the letter. He read it standing at the counter. It was from the county school board, not the local one, the county level above Healy's reach, and it was informing Miss Abigail Carter, as they still called her, that her teaching position in Willow Creek had been formally reviewed, following a petition submitted by 3 members of the town council, and that a hearing would be held in 30 days to determine her continued fitness for the role. He set the letter down. 3 council members, he said. Healy organized it, she said. After losing the school board vote, she went up a level. A pause. She's not wrong that this approach has more leverage. A county hearing carries more weight than a local vote. On what grounds? Abigail's voice was controlled, but he could hear the effort in it. Moral character. The specific language is they're arguing that a woman who entered a marriage of convenience for financial benefit is not a suitable moral example for children. The anger that moved through Luke was cold and specific and entirely focused. That's what they're calling it, he said. A marriage of convenience. That's what it was, she said carefully. At the start. He looked at her. Is that what you still think it is? She held his eyes. No. But what I think it is, and what I can prove it is to a county board, are 2 different things. He picked up the letter again. He read it a second time more slowly. He put it back on the table. I need to make some calls, he said. Luke, Abigail. He met her eyes. You fought the school board on your own because the circumstances required it. This is different. This is a county hearing with your livelihood at stake, and I am your husband, and I am going to help. Tell me you understand the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I understand the difference." "Good." He picked up his hat. "Don't touch the letter. I'll be back by noon." He was back by 10:30, which told her the conversation in town had not taken as long as he'd expected. He came in and sat down at the kitchen table with the focused energy of a man who has been doing something useful and knows it. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "She'll testify. She's been watching you teach those children for 12 years, and she has a memory like a court reporter." He set down a sheet of paper with names on it. "The Calloway family, the Burkes, the Halseys, the McIntyre family, whose son you tutored for 2 years after school without charging them a cent. That's 6 families minimum who will appear in person." She looked at the list. "You did this in 2 hours. People were willing." He paused. "More willing than I expected, honestly. I think the festival speech did something. Opened a door that had been stuck." She was quiet for a moment. "Who's representing the petition?" "Healy has a lawyer from Billings, man named Ferris. I know him by reputation. He's competent, but he's expensive, which means Healy's putting real money into this." His jaw set. "Which means she wants this badly enough to spend for it. She wants to make an example," Abigail said. "It's not really about me. It's about the fact that I didn't fall down when she expected me to." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "She's about to be disappointed again." Abigail looked at the list of names. She pressed her fingertip against Burke's name, then Clara's, then the Calloways. People who had come forward. People who had chosen to stand where the town had for years chosen to look away. "Luke," she said. "Yeah, if this goes badly, it won't. But if it does," she pressed, "I don't want you to feel like you've—" She stopped, started over. "This started as your arrangement, your contract, your ranch. I don't want my problems to become a weight on what you've built." He looked at her with an expression that was direct and unapologetic. "You became my weight to carry the day I put that ring on your finger. I don't mean that the way it sounds. I mean you're mine to stand beside. That's not a burden. That's what it means." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and crossed the kitchen and refilled his coffee cup and set it in front of him and stood there with her hand on the back of his chair, and she said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. And that too was something she had learned about the two of them, that silence between them had stopped being empty a long time ago. The 30 days before the hearing moved fast and slow at once, the way time moves when something significant is coming, and there is both too much and too little to do about it. Luke retained a lawyer of his own. Not from Billings, from Helena, a man named Caldwell, who had worked land law for 20 years and had the unhurried competence of someone who had seen most of what a county hearing could produce and was not impressed by any of it. Caldwell interviewed Abigail for 3 hours at the kitchen table one afternoon, and at the end of it, he looked at Luke and said, "Her record is immaculate. 12 years, not a single formal complaint student performance above county average every term. If Ferris is smart, he won't touch the teaching record. He'll go after the marriage." "Let him," Luke said. Caldwell looked at him. "That means they'll ask both of you in some form whether this marriage is real, and they'll be looking for inconsistency." "There won't be any," Luke said. Abigail was looking at the kitchen table. Something in her posture had changed. After Caldwell left, she stayed at the table without speaking for a moment. "He's right," she said finally. "They'll ask." "I know." "And what will you say?" He looked at her steadily. "The truth." She met his eyes. "Which is," he said it plainly and without performance, "that I married you because I had to. And that somewhere between the ledger books and the line shack and the school board letters and 6 months of watching you be the best person in any room you walk into, I stopped wanting any alternative to this." She absorbed that. The kitchen was very quiet. "That's what you'll say to the county board," she said. "That's what I'll say to anyone who asks," he said. "It's the truth. I don't have a different version." She looked at him with the open, unguarded expression that she had let him see only gradually over weeks as the armor came down piece by piece. And then she said very quietly, "I love you, Luke." She said it like a fact, like something she had been carrying for a while and had decided simply to put down in the open where they could both see it. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, just letting it be real. "I know," he said. "I love you too." He said it the same way, like a fact, like something confirmed rather than announced. "I've been trying to find the right time to say it. Turns out there isn't a right time. There's just the time you say it." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that surprised her. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and he watched her eyes go bright, and he thought not for the first time that her laugh was the most honest sound he had ever heard. "After a county hearing notice," she said. "That's your moment." "It got the job done," he said. She shook her head, still laughing, and he reached across the table and took her hand and held it. And she let him. And that was the end of that particular distance between them. The hearing was held on a Thursday in the county seat 20 miles from Willow Creek, in a meeting room above the land office that smelled like old paper and serious decisions. Healy sat in the front row with her lawyer and two of the council members who had signed the petition. She was composed and well-dressed, and had the expression of a woman who has prepared carefully and expects results. Abigail sat at the table with Caldwell on her left and Luke on her right, and she was calmer than anyone in the room expected, which Luke suspected unsettled Healy more than anything else could have. Ferris was good. Caldwell had been right about that. He opened cleanly, laying out the petition's argument in precise and professional language that Abigail Carter's marriage to Luke Maddox had been publicly documented as a financial arrangement brokered by the County Land Commission, that this arrangement raised questions about her character and judgment, and that the children of Willow Creek deserved a moral example whose own life choices were beyond reasonable question. He was careful. He didn't call her names. He just assembled the facts in an order that made the conclusion feel inevitable. Caldwell responded by putting 6 families on record in the first 40 minutes. The Callaways, the Burkes, Clara Whitmore, who had been observing Abigail's work since before Ferris had passed his bar examination and said so in those exact terms. Martha Halsey, who testified that Abigail had sat with her daughter through a fever one winter night when the doctor couldn't reach them and had not mentioned it to a single person afterward. The board listened. Their expressions shifted. Then Ferris made his move. He asked Luke directly had the marriage been entered into as a financial arrangement facilitated by the County Land Commission. Luke said yes. The room tightened. Ferris let a beat pass for effect. Then he asked whether Luke could characterize the marriage as anything other than a contractual convenience. Luke said, "Yes, I can characterize it as the best decision of my life. The county facilitated the introduction. Everything after that was us." Ferris tried to press on it. "Mr. Maddox, isn't it accurate that you initially refused the arrangement that you had to be persuaded?" "Yes," Luke said, "because I didn't know her. Any man who knows Abigail Maddox and needs to be persuaded to stand beside her has something wrong with his judgment. I had something wrong with mine. I corrected it." A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter. Something warmer. Healy's jaw tightened. Ferris shifted to Abigail. He asked her whether she had entered the marriage with full understanding of its contractual basis. "Yes," she said. He asked if she had represented the marriage as something other than what it was to the children she taught. "I've never discussed my personal life with my students," she said evenly. "What I have discussed is mathematics reading history and the importance of treating people with fairness regardless of what others tell you about them. If that's what's at issue, I'll stand on that record." Someone in the back of the room said quietly, but audibly, "Hear, hear." Healy turned to look. It was one of the council members she'd brought with her. He caught her eye and looked away, but he didn't take it back. Ferris recalibrated. He tried 2 more angles, both competent, both insufficient against the documentation Caldwell had assembled. The board chair, a pragmatic woman named Sutherland, who had been taking notes throughout, called a brief recess. They were out 22 minutes. When they returned, Sutherland read the finding without preamble. The petition was dismissed. Abigail Maddox's teaching certification and position were confirmed. The board found no basis in evidence or record for the claims raised. She looked directly at Abigail when she finished reading. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Maddox, your record is one of the strongest this board has reviewed in some time." Abigail said, "Thank you," in a voice that was steady and dignified, and gave nothing away, which Luke recognized as the professional version of the smile, composed, controlled, unassailable. He squeezed her hand under the table. She squeezed back hard, and he felt the full weight of everything she was managing, and he held it with her until the room began to empty. Healy left without speaking to either of them, which Luke considered the best possible outcome. Ferris packed his papers with the crisp efficiency of a man who loses professionally and doesn't waste time on it. Caldwell shook Luke's hand and Abigail's and said they'd been the easiest clients he'd had all year, which Luke suspected was not entirely true, but appreciated anyway. They drove back to Willow Creek in the late afternoon, the sky going orange over the mountains, and for the first mile, neither of them spoke, and it was the comfortable silence of two people who have just been through something together and need a moment to let it settle. Then Abigail said, "Sutherland, the board chair." "What about her?" She knew, before the ruling. I could see it in the first 20 minutes. She'd already made up her mind. A pause. "She asked us here anyway. Let the whole thing play out." "Due process," Luke said. "Due process," Abigail agreed. "And something else." She wanted Healy to hear it. All of it. "The testimony's your statement, the record." She wanted it on the public document. She looked at him. She was making a point to the town. Luke considered that. "Good." "Yes," Abigail said. "Good." They drove on through the early evening, and when the ranch came into view, the house, the barn, the lights in the bunkhouse where Ellis had clearly organized an early supper, Abigail looked at it with an expression he knew well by now. "Home," she said quietly. Not a question, not a statement to him, just something she was saying to herself, trying it on, finding that it fit. He stopped the wagon at the gate and got down and helped her down. And when she was standing in front of him, he looked at her in the evening light and said, "I have something I want to do, if you'll let me." She looked up at him. "What?" "I want to do the spring community celebration properly this year, in the square, and I want to stand up in front of whatever part of that town shows up. Luke, marry me, and say what I said on the Sunday street, but this time as a man who is not angry and not defending and not reacting to anything Croft said." He held her eyes. "I want to say it because it's true, and I want you to hear it in public in daylight with no crisis attached to it. Just the truth, about what you are and what this is." She looked at him for a long moment. She stopped. "That's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary," he said. "That's why I want to do it." Her eyes went bright. "And then," he said, "I want to ask you to marry me again. The right way. Not because Hatch arranged it or the bank required it. Because I'm choosing it. Because you're who I'm choosing." She pressed her lips together. The brightness in her eyes was losing the battle with gravity. "You already married me," she said. "I did a poor job of it the first time," he said. "I didn't know what I was getting. Now I do." She looked up at him, and the smile that crossed her face was not armor, and it was not performance, and it was not brave, and it was not professional. It was just Abigail, wide open, fully present, without a single layer of protection between herself and the world. "Yes," she said. "Ask me in the square, in front of all of them." He nodded. Then he kissed her. Standing at the gate of his ranch in the last light of an October evening, with the horses patient behind them, and the lights on in the bunkhouse, and the mountains going dark above everything, and it was the realest thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. The spring celebration came on the first warm Saturday of April. The square was full. It always was for the spring celebration. It was the town's exhale after the winter, the proof that they had survived another season, and people came from 20 miles out for it. The Halseys were there, the Burkes, the Callaways. Clara Whitmore with her good shawl. Ellis, who had dressed up, which he never did, which Cody was not allowed to mention. Healy was not there. She had moved to Billings in February, which the town discussed for 2 weeks, and then forgot, because Willow Creek had other things to pay attention to now. Luke stood up when the crowd had gathered, and he did not make a speech. He said 5 sentences. He said he had stood in this town 8 months ago, as a man who had been forced into a marriage he didn't want with a woman he didn't know. He said he had been wrong about everything he thought he understood about that situation. He said that Abigail Carter Maddox was the finest person he had ever known, and that the town's long treatment of her was its own shame to carry, not hers. He said he was grateful for every single day he had spent being wrong about her, because being wrong had led him somewhere true. And then he turned to Abigail, and he said simply in front of all of them, "I married you because I had to. I'm asking now because I want to. Will you marry me again?" She was crying before he finished the sentence. She didn't pretend otherwise, didn't reach for the armor, didn't smile through it like she was protecting herself from the impact. She just stood there and let it land, and she said yes, and she said it loud enough for the whole square to hear. The crowd. This town, this complicated, imperfect, slowly learning town, broke into applause that started at the edges and moved inward until the whole square was in it, and Clara Whitmore was clapping with both hands, and Burke had his hat off, and Cody was making a sound that Ellis would never allow him to describe as crying. Luke slipped the ring on her finger, a real one this time, not the plain band from the forced ceremony, but one he had ordered from Billings in February quietly, and kept in his desk drawer through the long winter. She looked down at it, then she looked up at him, and she smiled. Not the smile she had given the town for 11 years to survive it. Not the professional smile, not the armor, not the brave performance that had carried her through more cruelty than anyone in that square had bothered to count. This was the smile underneath all of it. The one that had always been there, waiting for the right person to stay long enough to see it. Warm and true and completely undefended. It lit up that square like the first day of spring. Years later, Willow Creek would tell the story of Luke and Abigail Maddox the way small towns tell the stories they're proud of, with some revision, some embellishment, and the particular conviction of people who have chosen to remember themselves at their best rather than their worst. They would tell it to their children, and their children's children, and they would say that Abigail Carter had come to Maddox Ranch as a stranger and made it a home, and that Luke Maddox had come to the altar, a reluctant man, and left it eventually, a grateful one. What they would not always say, what they would sometimes leave out, because it was the part that reflected least well on them, was how long it had taken them to see her clearly. How many years of quiet kindness she had offered a town that met it with mockery. How many times she had straightened her spine and held her smile and kept going when going was the harder choice. But Abigail remembered, and Luke knew, and between the two of them, that was enough. The woman the town had called an old maid had turned out to be exactly what she always was. The kind of person who shows up, does the work loves without expectation, and outlasts every story anyone tries to write about her. And the man who had been forced to marry her had turned out to be exactly what she needed. Someone who finally looked past the smile to find the person holding it up. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.